The flight from New York to Los Angeles began with an air of anticipation. As passengers settled into their seats, Steve, a white executive, found himself seated next to the Johnson family, a black couple and their 2 children. The Johnsons were excited about their trip, chatting animatedly as they stowed their carry-on luggage. Steve's demeanor shifted immediately upon realizing his seat assignment. His brow furrowed as he watched the Johnsons, and he began making pointed comments about the lack of space. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "How am I supposed to work in these cramped conditions?" The Johnson family exchanged concerned glances, their earlier excitement dampened by the palpable tension. Mr. Johnson attempted to adjust his seating position to create more space, but Steve's scowl only deepened. Other passengers began to take notice, their hushed whispers growing louder as Steve's complaints continued. Flight attendants, alerted by the growing unrest, approached to assess the situation. They tried to mediate, offering to help rearrange luggage or find alternative seating arrangements. However, Steve's attitude remained combative. "I paid for this seat," he insisted. "I shouldn't have to be uncomfortable for my entire flight." As the situation escalated, word quickly spread throughout the cabin. Passengers craned their necks to witness the unfolding drama, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disapproval. The Johnsons, clearly uncomfortable, tried to maintain their composure, focusing on comforting their children who had begun to sense the tension. In the cockpit, Captain Taylor was preparing for takeoff when he received word of the disturbance. Known for his strong stance on diversity and inclusion, the captain listened intently as his co-pilot relayed the details. Without hesitation, Captain Taylor made the decision to intervene personally. Emerging from the cockpit, Captain Taylor made his way down the aisle, his presence commanding attention from the passengers. As he approached Steve's row, the cabin fell silent, all eyes focused on the unfolding scene. The captain's expression was stern but composed as he assessed the situation firsthand. Steve, noticing the captain's approach, straightened in his seat, a mix of defiance and unease evident in his posture. The Johnson family looked up at Captain Taylor with a mixture of relief and apprehension, unsure of what would happen next. Captain Taylor addressed Steve directly, his voice firm but measured. "Sir, I understand there's an issue with your seating arrangement. Can you explain the problem to me?" Steve, emboldened by the attention, began to voice his complaints more explicitly, his thinly veiled racist remarks becoming more apparent. As Steve spoke, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense. Other passengers exchanged glances of disbelief and disgust. Captain Taylor listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Steve finished, the captain took a moment before responding, his words carefully chosen. "Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson," Captain Taylor turned to address the family. "I apologize for any discomfort you've experienced. Your presence on this flight is valued and welcome." He then turned back to Steve, his tone shifting to one of authority. "Sir, this airline has a strict policy against discrimination of any kind. Your behavior is unacceptable and will not be tolerated." Captain Taylor's intervention marked a turning point in the tense situation. With a firm but calm demeanor, he addressed Steve directly. "Sir, our airline prides itself on providing a respectful and inclusive environment for all passengers. Your comments and behavior are not aligned with these values." The captain then made a decisive move. "To ensure everyone's comfort and maintain a positive atmosphere, I've made the decision to upgrade the Johnson family to first class." This announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the cabin, followed by nods of approval from nearby passengers. Steve, caught off guard by the captain's decision, attempted to argue. "But I didn't do anything wrong. This is discrimination against me." His protests were met with disapproving murmurs from those around him. The once quiet cabin was now filled with a growing chorus of voices supporting the captain's decision. As Captain Taylor escorted the Johnson family towards first class, other passengers began to applaud. The family, initially shell-shocked by the entire ordeal, began to relax as they were led away from the hostile environment. Mr. Johnson thanked the captain, his voice thick with emotion. "We appreciate your stand against discrimination, Captain. It means more than you know. In first class, the Johnsons were greeted warmly by both the crew and other passengers. A businessman offered to switch seats so the family could sit together, while a flight attendant brought over complimentary drinks and snacks for the children. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the tension they had left behind. Meanwhile, back in economy class, Steve found himself isolated. Passengers who had witnessed his behavior now gave him a wide berth, some even requesting to be moved to different seats. The once crowded row around Steve became conspicuously empty, serving as a visual representation of the social consequences of his actions. Captain Taylor returned to the economy cabin to address the remaining passengers. "I want to thank you all for your patience and understanding. Our airline believes in treating all passengers with respect and dignity. We will not tolerate any form of discrimination on our flights." His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. Many passengers expressed their support for his actions, some even sharing their own experiences with discrimination while traveling. The captain's intervention had opened up a dialogue among the passengers, transforming the flight into an impromptu forum on inclusivity and respect. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the mood in the cabin had shifted dramatically. The tension that had permeated the air earlier was replaced by a sense of unity and purpose. Passengers who had been strangers just moments ago were now engaged in meaningful conversations about equality and respect. Steve, however, remained silent and sullen in his seat. The weight of his actions and their consequences was beginning to sink in. He watched as people around him bonded over shared values of inclusivity, feeling increasingly isolated and out of place. As the plane took off, Captain Taylor's voice came over the intercom, addressing all passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your cooperation. Let this flight be a reminder that in our society, there's no room for prejudice. We're all on this journey together." As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, the ripple effects of the earlier incident continued to spread throughout the cabin. In economy class, a young woman named Lisa, who had been quietly observing the events unfold, decided to speak up. Lisa, on her way to a civil rights conference in Los Angeles, felt compelled to share her own experiences with discrimination. Standing up in her seat, Lisa addressed the nearby passengers. "What happened earlier isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of the prejudice many of us face daily." Her voice, though calm, carried a weight that captured the attention of those around her. Lisa began to recount her own encounters with discrimination, from subtle microaggressions in the workplace to more overt acts of racism she'd witnessed. As she spoke, other passengers found themselves nodding in recognition, some even leaning forward to listen more intently. Encouraged by the attentive audience, Lisa continued, "It's easy to stay silent, to pretend these issues don't exist. But that silence is what allows discrimination to thrive. We need to speak up, to challenge these attitudes whenever we encounter them." Her words struck a chord with many passengers. Soon others began to share their own stories. An elderly man recounted the prejudice he faced as an immigrant decades ago. A young professional described the challenges of being the only person of color in her office. A parent spoke about teaching their children to navigate a world that wasn't always fair or kind. As more voices joined the conversation, the atmosphere in the cabin transformed. What had started as a tense situation evolved into a powerful moment of communal sharing and understanding. Passengers who had never spoken before found themselves engaged in deep, meaningful conversations about race, identity, and social justice. Meanwhile, Steve, still isolated in his seat, couldn't help but overhear these conversations. Initially, he tried to ignore them, burying himself in his laptop. But as the stories continued, he found himself reluctantly listening. The diversity of experiences being shared challenged his preconceptions and forced him to confront his own biases. One particularly poignant story came from a middle-aged woman sitting a few rows behind Steve. She described how her mixed-race children often faced prejudice, even from well-meaning individuals. "It's not always about overt racism," she explained. "Sometimes it's the assumptions people make, the subtle ways they treat you differently." Her words seemed to resonate with many, and Steve found himself shifting uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time, he began to consider how his actions might have impacted the Johnson family beyond just this flight. As the sharing continued, Lisa took on an informal role as moderator, encouraging more people to speak up and ensuring that everyone who wanted to share had the opportunity. The conversation expanded beyond personal anecdotes to discussions about systemic issues and potential solutions. "This is what change looks like," Lisa said, addressing the cabin. "It starts with understanding each other's experiences and recognizing our shared humanity." By this point, even some of the flight attendants had joined in, sharing their own observations of discrimination in the travel industry. The entire economy section of the plane had become an impromptu forum for dialogue and reflection on issues of race and equality. As the conversations in the main cabin continued, Captain Taylor returned to the cockpit. The atmosphere inside was a stark contrast to the lively discussions outside. Here, in the quiet confines of the cockpit, the captain had a moment to reflect on the events that had transpired. Settling into his seat, Captain Taylor checked his phone and saw a message from his wife. "Proud of you for standing up for what's right. Keep fighting the good fight," it read. A small smile crossed his face as he tucked the phone away, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Steve sat alone, the empty seats around him a physical manifestation of his isolation. The constant murmur of conversations about diversity and inclusion surrounded him, impossible to ignore. For the first time, he found himself forced to confront his own beliefs and actions. As he sat there, memories began to surface. Steve recalled instances from his past where he had made quick judgments about people based on their appearance. He remembered times when he had felt uncomfortable in diverse settings, always justifying his discomfort as a preference for the familiar. One particular memory stood out. A talented colleague passed over for promotion, despite being the most qualified candidate. Steve had been on the selection committee and had argued against the colleague, citing a lack of cultural fit. Now, with the conversations around him providing new context, he began to see that decision in a different light. These reflections were interrupted by the sound of laughter coming from the first-class cabin. The Johnson family, now settled in their upgraded seats, were enjoying their flight. The children were giggling over a movie, while Mr. and Mrs. Johnson chatted amiably with their fellow passengers. The contrast between the Johnsons' current situation and their earlier distress was stark. They had gone from being targets of discrimination to being celebrated and respected. This transformation served as a powerful example of how quickly things could change when people stood up against prejudice. Back in the cockpit, Captain Taylor was briefing his co-pilot on the situation. "It's not just about this one flight," he explained. "Every time we let discrimination slide, we're telling people it's acceptable. Today, we're sending a different message." The co-pilot nodded in agreement. "It's not always easy to step in, but it's necessary. You did the right thing, Captain." As they discussed the incident, both pilots reflected on their own experiences in the aviation industry. They talked about the progress that had been made in terms of diversity, but also acknowledged the work that still needed to be done. In economy class, the discussions had evolved. Passengers were now brainstorming ways to promote inclusivity in their own communities. Ideas ranged from organizing diversity workshops at workplaces to supporting minority-owned businesses. Steve, still isolated, found himself listening intently to these conversations. He began to realize the depth of the issue he had so casually dismissed earlier. The passion and pain in people's voices as they shared their stories made it impossible for him to maintain his earlier indifference. As the flight progressed, the atmosphere on the plane continued to evolve. What had started as a tense confrontation had transformed into a powerful moment of community building and education. Passengers who had boarded as strangers were now engaged in meaningful dialogue, forming connections that transcended the usual boundaries of a typical flight. The atmosphere on the plane had undergone a remarkable transformation. What began as a tense confrontation had evolved into a powerful demonstration of unity and understanding. Passengers who had boarded as strangers were now engaged in deep, meaningful conversations, sharing experiences and forming connections that transcended the usual boundaries of air travel. Throughout the cabin, people were embracing, exchanging contact information, and sharing stories of personal triumph over adversity. An elderly woman recounted her experiences as a civil rights activist in the 1960s, captivating younger passengers with her tales of courage and perseverance. A young entrepreneur shared how he overcame racial barriers to start his own successful tech company, inspiring others with his resilience. The sense of camaraderie was palpable. Passengers from diverse backgrounds found common ground, realizing that despite their differences, they shared many of the same hopes, fears, and dreams. This newfound unity served as a stark contrast to the division that had marked the beginning of the flight. Meanwhile, Steve remained in his seat, now completely isolated. The empty seats around him seemed to grow more conspicuous with each passing moment. He watched as passengers who had once been silent now animatedly shared their stories, their laughter and earnest discussions a constant reminder of his exclusion. Attempting to break out of his isolation, Steve tried to engage with a nearby passenger. "I think this has all been blown out of proportion," he began, his voice betraying a mix of defensiveness and uncertainty. However, his words were met with cold stares and turned backs. The passenger he had addressed simply shook her head and moved to join a nearby group discussion. This rejection hit Steve hard. For the first time, he began to truly feel the weight of his actions. The isolation he was experiencing was a direct result of his behavior, a realization that left him feeling both angry and ashamed. In the first-class cabin, the Johnson family was having a completely different experience. They were engaged in lively conversations with other passengers, sharing stories about their lives and their reasons for traveling to Los Angeles. The children, initially shaken by the earlier confrontation, were now happily chatting with a kind elderly couple seated across the aisle. Mrs. Johnson, in a quiet moment, turned to her husband. "You know, as awful as that situation was, I'm almost glad it happened. Look at all the positivity that's come out of it." Mr. Johnson nodded in agreement, watching as their children laughed with their new friends. Back in the main cabin, Captain Taylor's earlier intervention continued to resonate. Passengers discussed how his decisive action had set the tone for the entire flight. Many expressed admiration for his leadership and courage in confronting discrimination head-on. As the discussions continued, a sense of empowerment began to grow among the passengers. Many spoke about how this experience had inspired them to be more proactive in addressing inequality in their own lives and communities. Plans were made for community initiatives, mentorship programs, and awareness campaigns. Lisa, who had initially sparked the conversations, found herself at the center of many of these discussions. She skillfully guided the dialogue, ensuring that everyone felt heard and that the conversations remained constructive. Her passion for social justice was infectious, inspiring others to think more deeply about these issues. As the flight progressed, the transformation of the cabin was complete. What had started as a typical journey had become an extraordinary experience of human connection and social awakening. The passengers, once divided by an act of discrimination, were now united in their commitment to fostering a more inclusive and understanding world. As the flight entered its final hours, the impact of the earlier events continued to reverberate throughout the cabin. Captain Taylor, sensing the positive energy that had developed, decided to address the passengers once more. His voice came over the intercom, clear and resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to commend you all for the extraordinary display of unity and understanding I've witnessed today. Your willingness to engage in open, honest dialogue about difficult topics is truly inspiring." The cabin fell silent as passengers listened intently to the captain's words. Steve, still isolated in his seat, found himself hanging on every word, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "What we've experienced on this flight," Captain Taylor continued, "is a microcosm of the challenges and opportunities we face as a society. It's a reminder that when we stand up against discrimination and choose to listen to one another, we can create positive change." As the captain's speech concluded, A round of applause erupted throughout the cabin. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a sense of shared purpose and possibility. Inspired by the captain's words, Lisa stood up once again. "Everyone, I have a proposal," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Let's not let this moment end when we land. I suggest we start a campaign to promote diversity and inclusion, sharing our stories and the lessons we've learned today." Her suggestion was met with enthusiastic nods and murmurs of agreement. Passengers began to discuss how they could turn this idea into reality. "We could use social media to spread our message," suggested a young marketing executive. "Create a hashtag that encapsulates what we've experienced here." "And we could organize community events," added a teacher from the back of the plane, "bringing people together to have these kinds of conversations in person." The ideas flowed freely as passengers built upon each other's suggestions. There was a palpable sense of excitement as people realized the potential impact of their collective action. Amidst this flurry of planning, Steve sat silently, his earlier defiance replaced by a growing sense of unease. He could hear the passion in people's voices as they discussed ways to combat the very attitudes he had displayed earlier. The reality of how his actions were perceived was becoming increasingly clear, and it was an uncomfortable realization. In a moment of desperation, Steve pulled out his phone, attempting to distract himself by scrolling through his social media feeds. But as he did so, he noticed that news of the incident had already started to spread. Hashtags about inclusion and standing up against discrimination were trending, with many referencing a powerful moment on a flight from New York to LA. Panic began to set in as Steve realized the potential consequences of his actions. He frantically tried to delete some of his recent posts, aware that his online presence might now be scrutinized in light of the day's events. Meanwhile, the rest of the passengers were fully engaged in planning their campaign. Business cards were exchanged, contact information shared, and promises made to stay in touch after landing. The flight had become more than just a journey. It was the beginning of a movement. As the plan took shape, Lisa addressed the group once more. "Remember, what we're doing here isn't just about one incident or one flight. It's about creating lasting change in our communities and beyond. Each of us has the power to make a difference." Her words were met with a chorus of agreement. Passengers began to share commitments about actions they would take once they landed, from having difficult conversations with family members to advocating for more inclusive policies at their workplaces. As the flight neared its destination, there was a sense that something truly significant had occurred. What had started as a tense confrontation had transformed into a powerful catalyst for change, leaving most passengers feeling inspired and empowered. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Captain Taylor received an unexpected notification in the cockpit. The incident on board had not gone unnoticed by the outside world. Social media was buzzing with hashtags related to inclusion and diversity, and several news outlets had picked up on the story. Captain Taylor's decision to upgrade the Johnson family and his stance against discrimination had struck a chord with many. People were praising the airline for its swift and decisive action, and the story was rapidly gaining traction. Realizing the potential impact of the situation, Captain Taylor quickly briefed his co-pilot and the head flight attendant. "This has become bigger than we anticipated," he explained. "We need to be prepared for possible media attention when we land." Meanwhile, in the main cabin, passengers were still engrossed in their discussions about the proposed campaign for inclusion. Many had already started posting about their experiences on social media, using hashtags like Unity in the Sky and Flying Against Discrimination. The story was spreading rapidly, with likes, shares, and supportive comments pouring in from around the world. Steve, who had been trying to remain inconspicuous, felt a growing sense of panic as he scrolled through his phone. He could see the story unfolding in real time, with some posts specifically mentioning a disruptive passenger who had displayed discriminatory behavior. Although he wasn't named, Steve knew it was only a matter of time before he might be identified. In a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, Steve began frantically deleting his recent social media posts, and trying to untag himself from photos. His hands shook as he typed out a vague public apology, hoping to get ahead of the story. But deep down, he knew it might be too little, too late. As the plane prepared for landing, Steve made a last-ditch effort to speak with Captain Taylor. He approached the cockpit but was intercepted by a flight attendant. "Sir, please return to your seat. The captain is preparing for landing and cannot be disturbed," she said firmly. Before Steve could argue, another passenger spoke up. "Haven't you done enough damage already?" The man's voice was filled with disdain. "You're a perfect example of what's wrong with our society. It's time you faced the consequences of your actions." Steve retreated to his seat, face burning with shame and anger. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. What he had dismissed as a minor incident had snowballed into something that could potentially impact his personal and professional life. As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, there was a palpable sense of anticipation among the passengers. Many were eager to continue the conversations they had started and to begin implementing the ideas they had discussed for promoting inclusivity. Captain Taylor's voice came over the intercom one last time as the plane taxied to the gate. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived in Los Angeles. As we prepare to disembark, I want to thank you all for your role in making this flight a truly remarkable experience. Remember, the journey towards a more inclusive society doesn't end here. Carry the spirit of unity and understanding you've shown today into your communities." His words were met with enthusiastic applause. As passengers began to gather their belongings, there was a flurry of activity as people exchanged contact information and made plans to stay connected. Steve remained in his seat, watching as others around him celebrated the sense of community they had built. The contrast between their joy and his isolation was stark, serving as a powerful reminder of the consequences of his actions. As the passengers prepared to disembark, it was clear that this flight had been more than just a journey from New York to Los Angeles. It had become a catalyst for change, a moment that would continue to resonate long after they had left the plane. As the plane doors opened and passengers began to disembark, the atmosphere was electric with excitement and purpose. The Johnson family, who had been at the center of the earlier conflict, were among the first to exit. As they stepped into the jet bridge, they were met with a spontaneous round of applause from their fellow passengers in economy class. Mr. Johnson, visibly moved by the show of support, turned to address the crowd. "Thank you all for standing with us today. This experience has shown us the power of unity and the importance of speaking up against injustice." His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement from the assembled passengers. As the Johnsons made their way into the terminal, they were surprised to find a small group of reporters waiting. Word of the incident had spread quickly, and local media were eager to hear their story. Mrs. Johnson, composed and articulate, spoke briefly about their experience. "What started as a deeply upsetting incident turned into a powerful moment of community," she said. "We're grateful to Captain Taylor and all the passengers who stood up for what's right. It gives us hope for a more inclusive future." Meanwhile, the rest of the passengers began to file out of the plane. Many were still deep in conversation, exchanging contact information and making plans to stay connected. The sense of camaraderie that had developed during the flight was palpable, with strangers now parting as friends united by a common cause. Lisa, who had been instrumental in facilitating discussions during the flight, found herself surrounded by a group of passengers eager to continue their work. They huddled in the terminal, quickly setting up a social media group and planning their first post-flight meeting to further their campaign for inclusivity. Captain Taylor, as he exited the cockpit, was met with handshakes and words of appreciation from passengers. Many thanked him for his leadership and courage in handling the situation. The captain, humble but clearly moved, reminded everyone that it was their collective response that had made the real difference. "I just did what was right," he said. "It's all of you who turned this into something truly special. Remember, every day we have the opportunity to stand up for what's right and make a difference in someone's life." As the captain made his way through the terminal, he was approached by an airline representative who informed him that the company's PR team wanted to speak with him. The airline was considering featuring his actions in a new campaign promoting their commitment to diversity and inclusion. Steve, in stark contrast to the celebratory mood around him, was one of the last to leave the plane. He kept his head down, trying to avoid eye contact with other passengers. As he entered the terminal, he was acutely aware of the whispers and pointed looks in his direction. Attempting to make a quick exit, Steve was stopped by an airport security officer. "Sir, we've received some concerns about your behavior on the flight. We'd like to ask you a few questions." The realization that his actions would have consequences beyond just social disapproval began to sink in. As Steve was led away by security, he caught a glimpse of the Johnson family being interviewed by the media. The sight of them, poised and dignified in the face of adversity, forced him to confront the full impact of his behavior. Back in the terminal, the atmosphere was one of hope and determination. Passengers who had boarded the plane as strangers now parted as allies in a common cause. Many exchanged hugs and promises to stay in touch, their shared experience having forged bonds that transcended the usual transient nature of air travel. As the crowd began to disperse, heading towards baggage claim or connecting flights, there was a sense that what had transpired on this flight was just the beginning. The passengers carried with them not just their luggage, but a renewed commitment to promoting inclusivity and standing up against discrimination in their daily lives. The aftermath of the flight continued to unfold in the bustling Los Angeles International Airport. As passengers dispersed, the ripple effects of their shared experience spread outward, touching various aspects of their lives and the broader public consciousness. In the arrivals area, a small crowd had gathered around the Johnson family. Local news crews, alerted by the viral social media posts, were eager to capture their story. Johnson, with his family by his side, spoke eloquently about their experience. "What happened on that flight is a microcosm of what happens in society every day," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But it's also a powerful example of how people can come together to stand against discrimination. We're grateful for the support we received and hope this incident sparks meaningful conversations about inclusivity." As Mr. Johnson spoke, passengers from the flight who were passing by stopped to listen, nodding in agreement and occasionally adding their own perspectives to the impromptu press conference. The scene attracted more onlookers, with many recording on their phones and sharing the moment in real time on social media. Meanwhile, Lisa, still surrounded by a group of passionate passengers, was busy coordinating their next steps. They had already set up a social media group and were planning a virtual meeting for the following week to discuss their campaign for inclusivity. "We need to strike while the iron is hot," Lisa urged. "Let's use this momentum to create real change in our communities." The group agreed, quickly delegating tasks and responsibilities. Some volunteered to draft a mission statement, while others began reaching out to local organizations for potential partnerships. Captain Taylor, after speaking briefly with the airline's PR team, made his way through the terminal. As he walked, he was stopped repeatedly by passengers and even airport staff who had heard about his actions. Many wanted to shake his hand or simply express their appreciation for his leadership. The captain, while gracious, consistently deflected personal praise. "It wasn't just me," he explained to a group of admiring onlookers. "It was every passenger who chose to speak up, to share their stories, to stand together against intolerance. That's what made the difference." As these scenes of unity and purpose played out, Steve found himself in a small office with airport security. The gravity of his situation was becoming increasingly clear. Not only was he facing potential consequences from the airline, but his actions had now attracted the attention of law enforcement. "Sir, we've received reports of disruptive and discriminatory behavior on your flight," a security officer explained. "We need to take a formal statement from you about the incident." Steve, his earlier bravado completely deflated, nodded silently. Outside the office, Steve's image had already begun circulating on social media. While he wasn't officially named, many who had been on the flight or in the airport were sharing descriptions and discreetly taken photos. The court of public opinion was already in session, with thousands of comments condemning his actions and praising the response of the captain and other passengers. As the day progressed, the story continued to gain traction. Major news networks picked up on the incident, framing it as a powerful example of communities standing up against discrimination. Interviews with passengers, shaky cell phone footage from the flight, and sound bites from the Johnsons' impromptu press conference were splashed across screens nationwide. Social media exploded with hashtags related to the incident. Unity, In the Sky, Hearts, Stand Against Hate, and Be the Change trended globally, with people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and pledging to be more active in promoting inclusivity in their communities. The airline, recognizing the positive publicity generated by Captain Taylor's actions, issued a statement reaffirming their commitment to diversity and inclusion. They announced plans to review and strengthen their policies regarding discriminatory behavior on flights. As night fell on Los Angeles, the passengers from the flight had long since left the airport, but the impact of their journey continued to reverberate. What had started as a single act of discrimination had transformed into a powerful movement for change, touching lives far beyond the confines of that airplane. The following day, the ripple effects of the flight continued to spread, touching various aspects of society and the lives of those involved. Steve woke up to find his world turned upside down. His phone was inundated with messages and missed calls. As he scrolled through his social media feeds, he saw that his identity had been revealed overnight. His face was plastered across news websites and social media platforms, with headlines decrying his actions on the flight. With trembling hands, he opened an email from his employer. The message was terse. In light of recent events, we need to discuss your continued employment with the company. Please come to the office immediately. The realization that his behavior could cost him his job hit Steve hard. For the first time, he began to truly grasp the magnitude of his actions and their consequences. Meanwhile, Captain Taylor found himself thrust into the spotlight. Morning news shows were clamoring for interviews, praising his decisive action against discrimination. Despite his initial reluctance to be in the public eye, Taylor recognized the opportunity to spread a positive message. In a widely watched interview, Taylor spoke about the importance of standing up against injustice. "It's not about being a hero," he said. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. We all have that power." His words resonated with viewers, inspiring many to share their own stories of confronting discrimination. The airline, capitalizing on the positive publicity, announced a new initiative to promote diversity and inclusion in air travel. They revealed plans for mandatory sensitivity training for all staff and stricter policies against discriminatory behavior from passengers. Captain Taylor was offered a key role in developing these programs. The Johnson family, still processing their experience, decided to use their newfound platform for good. They were invited to speak at several community events about resilience in the face of discrimination. Their story became a rallying point for discussions about race relations and the importance of allyship. Lisa's grassroots campaign, born on the flight, was gaining momentum. The group had their first virtual meeting, attended by passengers from the flight and supporters who had heard about their initiative. They outlined plans for community workshops, a mentorship program for minority youth, and a social media campaign to raise awareness about everyday discrimination. As the day progressed, Steve's professional world continued to crumble. His company, after a brief meeting, decided to terminate his employment, citing violation of their code of conduct and the potential damage to their reputation. The news of his firing spread quickly, further cementing his status as a cautionary tale in the public eye. Overwhelmed by the situation, Steve finally reached out to a diversity consultant recommended by his former employer's HR department. For the first time, he began to confront his deep-seated biases and the harm they had caused. It was the beginning of a long, difficult journey of self-reflection and change. By evening, the incident had sparked a national conversation about racism and discrimination in everyday life. Talk shows, podcasts, and online forums were buzzing with discussions about how to create a more inclusive society. Many shared their own experiences of standing up against discrimination, inspired by the passengers on the flight. The airline's stock price saw a significant boost, with investors responding positively to their handling of the situation and their new diversity initiatives. Other companies in the travel industry began to review their own policies, recognizing the importance of taking a strong stance against discrimination. As night fell, Captain Taylor sat in his home, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past 2 days. He picked up a framed photo of his late father, who had faced discrimination as one of the first black pilots in commercial aviation. "We've come a long way, Dad," he murmured, "but we've still got work to do." The events that unfolded on that flight from New York to Los Angeles had become more than just a viral story. They had sparked a movement, challenging people to reflect on their own biases and inspiring them to take action in their communities. It was a powerful reminder that change can begin in the most unexpected places, even at 30,000 feet in the air.